This is 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World, a podcast mini-series brought to you by the Matan Women's Institute for Torah Studies. This entire series is dedicated in memory of the heroes our nation has lost in the past year and a half, and in prayer for the return of our remaining hostages. Each week, one of the Jewish world's most erudite and wisdom-seeking Torah scholars is rereading an iconic biblical text in light of the changing Israeli, Jewish, and world reality since October 7th. Ideas that they have felt changing within them in the past year and a half. While there has been unfathomable loss and atrocity, we will emerge from this stronger if we are able to elucidate for ourselves and to the world what it is that we have learned from these challenges. Dr. Malka Simkovich is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society and visiting professor at Yeshiva University's Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. Her first book, The Making of Jewish Universalism From Exile to Alexandria, was published in 2016. Her second, Discovering Second Temple Literature, the Scriptures, and Stories That Shaped Early Judaism, was published with JPS in 2018 and received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Her third book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, was published in June 2024. Malka, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast and on this series. We've spoken on my Parsha channel, but it's really a pleasure to have you here. And as someone who thinks really candidly about our sacred texts, I really wanted your voice in this series. So thanks for being here.
Yosefa, thank you for having me. It's so good to be with you today.
So our topic for today is quite a different text than the ones that I've been looking at in several of our other episodes. We're going to be looking at a prophetic text. We're going to be looking at the book of Yirmiyahu, of Jeremiah. And I guess I kind of just want to zoom in on the particular section that we'll be speaking about. The actual prophecy is one that, for a whole host of reasons, is possibly, right? If anyone's familiar with something from the book of Jeremiah, this is probably the section that one will be familiar with. And that is likely because it's highly unusual. Because the book of Jeremiah is a very painful book of prophecy. The vast majority of it are prophecies of doom, what we call nevuot poranut. And it's because Jeremiah was our prophet of destruction. He was the voice that accompanied us to the end of the First Temple period. And his book is very much a reflection of that. You know, we have the book of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah, who he's actually prophesying in a very, very good time. We have victories. We have a good time for the city of Jerusalem. But Jeremiah is living in a totally different milieu, and that's deeply reflected in his book. And so when we all of a sudden have 4 chapters of comfort, I think they catch the eye both of any learner and reader flipping through the book of Yirmiyahu. And I think also nationally and the whole world really has paid attention to these 4 chapters. I think possibly because they are so unusual against the backdrop of the rest of the book of Yirmiyahu. So with that sort of broad introduction, we could spend a lot of time speaking about what he was, who he was as a prophet, the fact that he was living a very tortured life. Nobody ever liked to listen to him. But we're going to sort of take a deep dive into some of the theology that's reflected in these 2 chapters in Jeremiah 30, 31, Yirmiyahu Lamed and Lamed Aleph. And I'll let you take it from here, Malka.
I'd be glad to say a little bit about what's going on at the end of the 7th century and the early 6th century BCE. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But as you said, Yirmiyahu is predicting that the people, the Yehudim, will be exiled and telling them to surrender to that experience of captivity, not to fight back, not to rebel. And those prophets who proclaim that the people will not be taken captive and will be saved, those are false prophets. So the disaster is imminent, as is the divine salvation that will follow. One of the really interesting aspects of Yirmiyahu's book is the way that he draws from the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, and the language that is evoked here is comparable to language that we find in Shemot and Exodus and in Devarim and Deuteronomy, but also with some really striking differences, and I hope to dive into those differences with you over the course of this conversation. What we're going to find at the end of chapter 31, Lamed Aleph, is that God is going to offer the people an entirely new brit, a new covenant. And the question is, what is the nature of this new covenant? How is it different from the covenant that the people received following their exodus from Egypt. And what we find is that there's a sense that the people really failed with that first covenant. They did not adhere to the terms that God had presented to them. And the consequence of that is that they suffered gravely. They suffered in the land, of course. God gives them centuries worth of chances, and the people don't step up when they need to. And so the exile to Babylonia is a culmination of all of those centuries of sin, of rejection of God, rejection of the relationship that he offered them, basically a pushing away of the divine hand. And Yirmiyahu says that God is going to offer them a new kind of a relationship that will enable the people to rethink the dynamics. No longer will this relationship be defined according to some kind of familial analogy. In other words, the analogy that we find in earlier texts and earlier scriptures, the analogy of comparing the covenantal relationship between a husband and a wife, or a father and a son, a father and a daughter, sometimes a mother and a child. All of these analogies will no longer work in this new covenantal relationship. And as this relationship will be built, we find actually elsewhere in Yirmiyahu a prediction that Egypt will finally be punished for what it had done to the people. And ironically, or maybe satisfyingly, it will be punished by Babylon itself. And so Babylon, Bavel, is the instrument, the divine instrument, by which God will right all the wrongs and begin this new relationship and start fresh.
Okay, so we have this sense that the people are going to suffer tremendously, meaning in the book of Yirmiyahu really describes all of the sins that people have done, and which the people themselves, by the way, famously in a chapter in Yirmiyahu and also in other books, don't necessarily dot the I's and cross the T's in the way that Yirmiyahu does. They famously do not see reality at all in consonance with the way he does. But even that being the case, the enemy nations will still receive their just due in the long run.
Absolutely, the people see a different reality than Yirmiyahu. We know there are numerous instances in which Yirmiyahu is mistreated by the people. He's put in jail. He's thrown into a pit. He has to flee to Egypt. And like I said, there are false prophets who are telling the people, don't listen to Yirmiyahu because the truth is that God is going to save us. And all you have to do is sit tight. Even the king himself, when he receives a scroll that contains prophetic writings that Yirmiyahu and his scribe Baruch had written down, this scroll is torn up and tossed into the fire. And this is not just a rejection of the prophetic word. This is violence being done to the divine message. It is a violent act to rip up the words of the prophets. So Yirmiyahu in every way is embattled. He's on his own. Of course, he has his scribe Baruch at times, but he's dealing, like you said, Yosefa, he's dealing with a community that sees reality very differently. And at one point, there's a substantial community of Yehudim who flee to Egypt, and Yirmiyahu reminds them that Egypt is the place of temptation, the place that we want to return to, the place that, according to Devarim Yud Zayin, Deuteronomy 17, we are forbidden from returning to and settling in. And this cannot be the place of our future. It is not the place of our future. And so Yirmiyahu, from various directions, is a totally embattled figure. In terms of when to date these chapters, and 30 and 31 in particular, I cannot say with confidence, but I do think that there are some really interesting parallels with the story of the recovery of the scroll of the Torah that we find in Malachim Bet and 2 Kings chapters 20 and 23. There, King Yoshiyahu, at the end of the 7th century BCE, has the temple cleaned out. And his scribe, who is actually an ancestor of later very important figures that are living during Yirmiyahu's time that come into conflict with him. But in any case, the scribe Shaphan and Hilkiah, the high priest, and others discovered this scroll with words of the Torah written on it, and this galvanizes King Yoshiyahu to establish essentially a new brit with the people. That's what it's called. Again, it's not coming from God, it's coming from the king, but the connection between the Torah, the words of the Torah, the Sefer HaTorah, and the brit is a very, very close connection. And so when we talk about a brit in Yirmiyahu, it's possible that we're talking about something connected to this restoration, maybe happening in the wake of the restoration. This is a time of hope. Again, not a time when Yirmiyahu thinks we've avoided all danger, but it is a time of hope nonetheless. So it could be that this has something to do with the restoration of Yoshiyahu. And actually, one really interesting connection between the stories is that Yoshiyahu takes all the idols that the people have been worshiping and throws them, he burns them, and he throws the ashes, if I recall correctly, into Nahal Kidron. I don't know the verse on hand, but he throws it into Kidron, and there's a reference, sure enough, at the end of chapter 31 to that same area in the context of restoration. So if you look very carefully, you will find some very fascinating parallels. Again, it doesn't mean that Yirmiyahu was saying these words at the time that Yoshiyahu was gathering the people for restoration, but perhaps it's evocative of that story.
Right. And I will just say that if it is connected to that time period, it would place these prophecies very, very early in his career. I would place it relatively at the beginning of his career, and it would also place these prophecies well before he has a very clear sense of the destruction, if we're going with that. So we're not wed to this kind of dating. And as you said, he could also just be playing on motifs that were so well known at the time. And it could also be said later. But let's bring ourselves into this. We can't call it a narrative. It's really almost like an anthology of comfort poems that Yirmiyahu speaks of. And before we get to sort of this question of what about these verses and these at this point the pretty famous verses of comfort, before we get to hear how you're sort of looking at them differently, why don't we just get a broad sense of what we have? You know, I know many people are listening to podcasts and they're driving in their car or they're folding their laundry, but if you happen to be in a place where you could even open up a Tanakh, a Bible on hand, it might be helpful for this particular episode. But either way, Malka, why don't you just bring us in to have a sense of the images that are sort of passing before our eyes in this collection that we have in Yirmiyahu 30:31.
And look at the chapters as twin chapters or partner chapters, with chapter 30, Perek Lamed, being the view from the top, a description of how God will enter into the physical realm and save the people and bring salvation. And chapter 31, Perek Lamed Aleph, being the view from the bottom. What happens to these people once they receive the beneficent blessings of God? And so in Perek Lamed, we find various descriptions or metaphoric descriptions of God saving the suffering people. In verse 8, for example, God breaks the yoke from upon the people's necks, implying that the people are like an egel, a calf, and we find that description explicit elsewhere in Yirmiyahu. In the next section, we have God saving the people. So if it's okay to just use the Hebrew phrases, in verse 8, we have God saying, Eshbor ulo, I'll break the neck as if these are cattle, me'al tzavarecha, from upon your neck. In verse 10, in Yud, we have Ki hineni moshiacha mirachok, I will be your savior. And later, God brings refuot. God is bringing healings to the people who are wounded. And those wounds are described extensively. And the point here is that there is a kind of progressive salvation, I think, which emerges, if you have a close reading, with God breaking the yoke of the people, saving them, bringing them into a safe place, and then allowing them to heal. Now, if you think about this process And you could think about it as a process, and you can also think about it as different vignettes where Israel, the people are a calf, or perhaps they're a very sick person, or perhaps they're a ravaged, innocent woman. We'll find all three of those, but you could also look at this progressively, again, as breaking the yoke and then saving and then bringing healing. Now, taking all of that into the reading of Perek Lamed Aleph of chapter 31, I think is very illuminating, because here we have what I would call the view from the bottom. Rather than saying, God is going to break the young calf, we have the image of the people as an egel lo lumad in verse 17, a young calf who hasn't learned, but who so desires, who so thirsts for a relationship with their parent. We have the people who have been sick, but nonetheless, they are coming to gather to return back in the land and restore it in verse 7. The Iver, Ikiseach, I guess we would say, although it's kind of crass, the blind and the paralyzed, I don't know if a better word, the lame, again, maybe there's a better word, Hara v'yoledet, those who are pregnant or have recently given birth, people who are experiencing maladies that would have made them vulnerable, all of those people and more will return, and they will be saved, they'll be healed, rather than having simply the image of the calf with the yoke on them. We also have the image of the people as sheep and God as the shepherd, and we have most powerfully the image of the Bitulah, rather than describing the people as a ravaged woman. We have the kind of innocent, joyous young woman and young man dancing and planting. And so this recurring theme, there's a lot going on with all of these metaphoric images. I think that they should all be read together. But on the one hand, we have Perek Lamed, chapter 30, where God is breaking the yoke, right, of the cat and saving them and healing them. And here we have the reverse. We have the young cat. We have the people who are overcoming their maladies. We have the youthful innocence. And what are they doing? They are dancing in the streets. And Yosefa, we could talk about October 7th, but the whole time that I was reading this, and I'll tell you when I first returned to this chapter after October 7th in a minute, but I kept thinking, we will dance again. I mean, that is the refrain of this chapter. The people are dancing, the children, the young adults, the elderly, they're dancing, they're planting. What does this come down to? It's freedom of movement. They're flowing, they're moving freely. It's the opposite experience of captivity, of dispersion, and then the consequent frozenness that takes place after the people are forcibly removed from their homes and placed into these foreign lands, and then they're stuck, right? But in this chapter, we have total freedom of movement to plant, and not only to dance, but not only to plant, but also to dance and also to rejoice. And of course, above all, to worship God, to return to Zion, to return to the temple, and build that new breed. And so
just two ideas, kind of highlight also two other things in the chapter. So one of the reasons why these chapters are usually more familiar is because of the appearance of Rachel, right? We have almost no posthumous appearances of biblical figures other than Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, who comes up in the book of Malachi. And we have here Rachel. Perhaps you can count the recalling of Shmuel, of Samuel from the dead later on by Shaul. But here we have the image of Rachel, who comes back to life essentially to be the eternal mother, and that's the Rachel Mevakal Banea. But what I think is also really important to mention in these chapters is that the late word is the root shuv, is to return. And so while Yirmiyahu spends his career telling the people that they're going to be sent out of the land of Israel and they're going to lose their place and they're going to be displaced, and well, to us this seems pretty common because we don't know of an Israel who isn't displaced to a certain degree. We have to remember this hasn't happened yet in history, meaning this will be the first time that happens. And so the root of Shin Vav Bet, of Shuv, is so significant, and it appears really an enormous amount of times in these verses. And Rachel becomes sort of the almost like the figure that watches over our ability to return. And then we have this idea of hatzivi lach tzionim, that God says, when you're on your way out being exiled, sort of like make little ditches, make little signs for yourself so you'll know where to return to. So just that piece is really tremendously significant, specifically in Lamed Aleph, this idea that we will have what to return to in addition to the metaphors that you are mentioning, or the images that get flipped between the chapter 30 and 31.
A great point. This phrase, V'shavti et shavut ami Israel, it appears so often in variations throughout these two chapters, and also beyond. If you take a look at Yirmiyahu Lamed Gimel, chapter 33, you find this language coming up again, and really quite often in the book. So this theme of restoring those captives is so important, and that language is really at the foreground. Yosefa, I wasn't sure when we would get to this. I know it was inevitable to talk about Revel, and I really feel pretty ambivalent about how to understand this climactic section, this very difficult section that I think is so overly familiar to all of us, or to many of us, and yet is so mysterious and challenging. And the reason why I find it so challenging is because we begin with imagining Rachel as the consummate mother. Of course, Rachel, the one who yearns, who longs for motherhood, and advocates in this chapter, and of course in the Midrashic tradition, on behalf of her children. And yet the function of motherhood is taken over by God. There are many reasons why I find these verses in chapter 31, from verses 15 to 19, very, very difficult. And one feature, maybe not even the most difficult feature, but one feature is the fact that it ends with God saying, I am going to take on this maternal responsibility. Al kain hamum me'ai lo rachem archamenu ne'um Hashem. So it's almost, and maybe you have a different reading of it, but it's almost as if God says to Rachel, you know what? I got this. Ephraim is knocking on my door, asking to be forgiven, asking to be restored. I'll take it from here. You've reminded me of my own maternal role. God says to Rachel, thank you for doing that. Now you can step aside and I will return them.
I think that I agree with the understanding of the words, but I guess I haven't necessarily connected the two verses to each other in the exact same way. Meaning, I didn't necessarily look at God overtaking the role of Rachel. I kind of thought that Rachel has her job specifically in terms of the return, but in terms of repairing the relationship between the people and God, that's something that has to happen between the people and God, and not necessarily between, right? Rachel, she's not an emissary in that. She's sort of a figure who can preside over and can welcome them back. But that the verses specifically about meaning God will miss us, but there has to be some sort of repairing that happens in the relationship.
Because of this hamu me'ai, my insides are aroused. One might say rachem arachamenu. This
for sure, you have the rechem. No, I agree with you. He is describing himself in this female imagery. I agree with that.
Here's why I feel very flummoxed by this section. Putting Rachel aside, the image of the child who has sinned, who has angered the parent, who's knocking on the locked door saying, let me in, please forgive me, over and over and over, it does something in me. And I think maybe it's more painful to read given our current situation. So yeah, I think maybe we're saying something very similar to one another, which is Rachel is a mother figure. She is a kind of mediator. She is an emissary, an advocate, a maternal advocate. But the real, I'm not going to say person, the real party who is responsible for the welfare of the people is always going to be God. Always. Mm-hmm. And so Rachel will draw from her life experiences as a mother to remind God, the consummate mother, really, the consummate parent, of God's responsibility to the people. It cannot be passed on to anyone. It has to be God. But this familial relationship, I think the prophet is saying, is a really problematic one. I think any familial relationship, whether it's husband to wife, parent to child, mother to son, there's our dark side here to thinking about God within this familial setting. And I think the prophet knows it. And I think ultimately, the prophet envisions a brit that lacks those familial aspects. Because again, there's a very dark side of pain and suffering and vulnerability in these relationships. And I think Yirmiyahu was saying, look, of course, in this moment, we are the rejected children of our parent, of God. But there will be a time where we have a different kind of relationship, one that cannot be described using metaphors of family, using metaphors of the angry husband and the angry father. And that's what we're hoping for. We're actually not hoping for a mother-child relationship. We're not hoping for, maybe even not hoping for a husband-wife relationship. I think there's something really troublesome here that Yirmiyahu tucks into.
Okay, but where do you see that in this chapter, he is looking for a day where there isn't that metaphor? Because I understand that when we're looking at it from our perspective, right, Yirmiyahu does here waver between metaphors, right, between the parent and child, between the mother and child specifically, also spousal. Yirmiyahu famously, not just in this chapter, but in many, really utilizes all these metaphors. And as you said, at a certain point, we come up against the wall of the metaphor, that it has its limitations. If we describe God and the people as being married, well, it's not really a marriage, because in an actual marriage, you can get divorced. And then the prophets don't want to come up against that issue. So then they have to describe either the fact that we have a very different kind of marriage with God who can't divorce us, right? Or we have to then switch to a different metaphor, because that's where we meet the metaphor's edge. If we speak about parents and children, right, well, the norms of parents and children can also be different. And so every metaphor has its limitation. And so prophets, by the way of just their speaking and trying to be relatable to the people that they're trying to pass a message onto, often have to switch between them. But where do you see this idea? Meaning, I don't think it seems that Yirmiyahu has a problem with this metaphor. I understand that you're saying that you really, smacks as something that could be very, very painful. But I'm curious where you see coming through that Yirmiyahu himself has a problem with it.
So I see it in the description of the Brit Hadashah in Parak Lamed Aleph of chapter 31, Pasuk Lamed.
Why don't we read those? Why don't we read those psukim? Read those verses.
Let's do it. And I think, or the way I read it, is that this is an explicit rejection of the familial relationships that we have seen. So, Hine, Yamim Ba'im Ne'um Adonai, Efarati, et Beit Yisrael, but Beit Yehuda, Brit Chadashah. Okay, I said the whole verse because I said God's name. Look, there are days that are coming, says God, where I'm going to establish for the house of Israel and Judah this new covenant. I don't think covenant is a good translationship for Brit. I really think it's relationship. But okay, a new covenant. And it'll be unlike every other covenant that we've ever had in the past, God says. Because whatever happened, and now I'm kind of inserting my own editorial thoughts here. Whatever happened when the people left Exodus, it didn't work, right? Here we are. We're back on the cusp. We're back on the cusp of leaving the very thing that God promised us when we were exiting that terrible place. I want to concentrate on that, Yosef, in a second. Lo tiyam eretz Mitzrayim, asher hema hifiru et briti, va'anochi ba'alti vam mi'um Adonai. Okay, this is it. This is the verse where I think this holds everything. It will not be like the brit that I established with her fathers and now let's talk about how to translate, because I didn't look up a lot of translations here, but let's, I'm curious to know again what you think, but it won't be like the brit that I established with their fathers. When I see, the question here is force. Is hachaziki bi'adam when I took their hand to take them out of Egypt, when I grasped their hand, when I pulled their hand, when I, it's like the
but it's also meant to be a play on words of the bigad chazakah, right?
Yes,
Meaning,
yes.
Okay, it's the strong hand of Egypt, the mighty hand.
I agree for sure, but there's also this forcefulness, right? God is taking them, right, and taking them by the hand and leading them out, out of Egypt. Yeah, and then what did they do? They broke the covenant. And now here's another phrase I think is really important. I'm not sure exactly how to translate Va'anochi ba'alti vam, Could it be I espoused myself to them? I became their owner. I became their Baal, says God. Okay, so now I think, and is this too midrashic? Am I reading too much into it? I think that we have two images here. We have the image of the parent and the child. Ziki ve'adam, took them by the hand, took them out of Egypt. And then once they were out, I espoused myself to them. And of course, there's so much material out there about how the Exodus is the process of a birth into adolescence, into adulthood, into establishing a maybe more equal relationship. Let's put that all aside. Let's just, I guess, keep going a little more. That's not going to be what happens next, God says. Ki zot habrit asher chotet Beit Yisrael acharei hayamim hahen mi'um Adonai natati torati b'kirbam ve'al libam echbebem v'hayiti lahem le'Elohim v'hema yiyu li la'am. That is the key. What's going to happen in the future? Here's a new breed. Here's a new relationship. God says, I'm not going to be your father. I'm not going to be your mother. I'm not going to be your husband. I'm not going to be your doctor or your farmer or your shepherd. I will be your God. This is the only healthy way. And you will be for me to, you'll be to me as a nation. Now, Yirmiyahu, of course, is not writing these words. These words come from the Torah. We have them elsewhere. In the Torah, we have variations of this phrase. We see it in Bamidbar Tetvav. We see it in Vayikra in Leviticus 26. We see it in other prophets, but I think it's really used in a new way here.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's being reinterpreted here. Yes, and it also is a phrase that appears at the end of chapter 30. So if you look at the end of the previous chapter, in chapter 30, verse 22, and then here, this is totally different. And I guess I'll just read the last verse. This is a really interesting image, and I'm curious to know what you make of it. Again, we have this kind of familial model, but that's for the real people, right? We're not going to have a situation where people are trying to instruct their friends or tell their friend, tell their brother, Lamor, De'u et Adonai ki chulam yed'u oti miktanam v'ad gedolam me'um Adonai ki eslach rabonam v'lechatam lo eskor od. So, yes, you'll still have your social structures. You'll still have your brothers and your friends. But it's not going to be a situation where there's a hierarchy of some people having closer access to knowledge of God than others. Anyone can achieve that knowledge of God. And I think that the knowledge of God here, we could talk about the connection with the story of the Exodus, where this theme is so important. But I think the point here is you're going to know God in a way that you've never known God before. You're not going to have to play with imperfect analogies, with metaphors that are so limited, that so often veer off into realms of pain, really abuse. That's going to be a thing of the past. You're going to know me on the most intimate levels, and that's the prophecy. Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is if you think about of Yirmiyahu as a prophet who's really coming at the end of the First Temple period, and he's spanning, a good 40, 50 years. But we have spent centuries at this point building up these metaphors. Meaning, there's even a great passage that I always speak about that in the book of, we have this great question, why start with the book about families, right? Why not begin with actually talking about God? And there's some great ideas that have been offered by others. I like to quote in the name of Rabbi Sachs, but the idea that the family becomes a foundation of all the metaphors through which we describe a relationship with God. So maybe it behooves us to understand a little bit about all the pitfalls of family and how families can be your greatest high and your greatest low, and it'll give us insight into God as our spouse, and God as our brother, and God as our mother, and all those metaphors. But what you're kind of saying, if I'm understanding, is that we've kind of reached an end to the arc, if we interpret this passage this way, that it's enough, meaning, and that when we talk about us being, together with God, I'm purposely not using the word wedded, but when we find ourselves being at one with God, it'll be at one with God without having to have the translation of these metaphors. And that ultimately we use metaphors because as humans, we don't really know what it means to know God. We don't really know what that thing is. And so when we're looking for language, we're trying to look for language that's as reminiscent as the human relationships that we have, but that at some point we max out. Now, has this time come? I think it's interesting. We'll ask that question, but meaning that's your understanding, Yirmiyahu, in this passage, right?
I totally agree with that. And I think that this model, yes, it's mysterious, but that's exactly a point, is that there is a degree of agency in which we are enabled to define maybe a little more freely the nature of our relationship, because we aren't working within the strictures of these familial metaphors. So what does it mean to have this relationship with God? Well, the answer isn't in this prophecy, but I do think that there's an allusion here to the people having more agency, more freedom when it comes to what that relationship will look like, and also an expectation that they will step into that role and do it right.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But Malka, why is this what's catching you at this moment?
I mean, this is the question. I've thought, like many people, about this passage as one that was kind of co-opted by church fathers and the Christian tradition in a way that really centered it in that tradition. And I always thought it doesn't have the same importance, centrality, or inherent force even in Jewish tradition. And I guess the reason why I thought that is because I never had an answer for what the Brit Chadashah would be for Jews. It's obvious what it would be for Christians, who would say, well, this is a prediction of the new covenant, a new relationship that is not bound by law or not limited to the Jews. Maybe.
By the way, Malka, I just want to interrupt you for 1 second for any of our listeners who are not totally familiar with the fact that this becomes the basis of what's called, right, supersessionism. Am I getting that phrase right?
No,
I don't have the same background as you do in Christian Jewish relations, but that this is, anyone who knows the New Testament, the Brit Chadashah, it's from here, people, if we're not familiar. This is a big parak for Christians, and Malka, who's spent decades of her life working in a Christian setting, that's a resounding meaning and layer of this, right? So just want to level the playing field for everyone listening. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Yosepa. Thank you. I didn't have an alternative Jewish reading that I felt was satisfactory because, of course, as Jews, we can talk about the development of the Brit. We can talk about the continuity of the Brit. We can talk about the evolution of the Brit. And I do think that is a very compelling way to understand the Brit. If you look at the Brit that God makes with Abraham, right, first reference in Genesis 12, 15, 17, 22, and of course, going into Exodus 20 and into Deuteronomy, over time, the people take on more responsibility. Expectations are raised. The stakes are raised. And the more that God expects of the people, the more they can fall. None of that explains a Brit Chadashah, right? None of that explains what it would mean to start over with a totally new dynamic. And I didn't have a satisfactory reading of this passage, and I still don't, I'll be very honest. But why it catches my eye now is because in this world, in this moment of crisis, I think that it is very empowering to read a text that imagines us having agency. And I know that sounds that sounds very postmodern, right? We're taking the power and we're producing literature that empowers us because we have no power. This is like what every graduate student dreams of, discourses of power. But I do think that when we are incredibly vulnerable, there's something very meaningful about talking about agency. And I think that's exactly what Yirmiyahu gives us. We can respond to crisis and catastrophe by thinking about how one day we will be the passive recipients of salvation. And indeed, that is what Jews have done for 2 millennia. In the first century, most Jews believed that they were suffering at the hands of the Romans because they were on their cusp of the Messianic age. Of course, the very opposite is true. The temple was about to fall. And in the medieval era, and of course in modern times, it's very natural to talk about the worst suffering being the kind of last chapter before the sun rises again. Honestly, I think that's very problematic. But I do think that in times of catastrophe, not only can we, but I think it's a good thing, it's a healthy thing to think about what can we do, what can we take back into our own hands, what can we build, rather than waiting for God to show up and put us on the wings of eagles.
I want to respond to that. First of all, I'm thinking about the fact that, just a small anecdote here, that I don't remember, a month or so into the war part of after October 7th, I'm not a let's bring Mashiach tomorrow person. It's not my MO, but I know that I'm a very conscious person. And so whenever something happens to me that's not so conscious, it's always fascinating to me. And so one of the things that happened that I started singing at my then very, very infant son, a first boy, I added a song to the repertoire of nursing before bed, and I was adding the Ani Mamin, right, that I believe that Mashiach will come, and that's a very natural song that gets sung in all different, even just national ceremonies in Israel, not only in religious settings. And so it's interesting because I know that I was obviously looking for some sort of anchor. So I'm not I don't have my suitcase packed, but I also live pretty close, so I don't really have to have my suitcase packed to go anywhere so far. But so it is a natural thing to hold on to in moments of crisis. But that being said, I think that for centuries we were so we had no power, and so that was the only straw that people could sort of grasp at. But today we do have power and we have the autonomy, and I think that even just from a consciousness level is a tremendous shift in who we are in the past, 77 plus years as a people. And so I think that up until that point, there wasn't that much else to grab onto.
I think that's 100% right. Now, the question, though, is how do we interpret the foundation and the existence of the sovereign state of Israel? And do we have the right to? That's exactly the question. But in terms of vulnerability, it's funny for me to say we. I'm sitting here in Skokie, Illinois, and I'm kind of taking credit for the existence of the state of Israel and its army. Sure.
Go for it. Belongs to all of us.
We have an army. It's just it's so terrible for me to talk like that, honestly, because I don't have children in the army, but the Jewish people do have to speak about themselves as one polity. Especially when we're all treated as one polity by outside.
I'll 100% agree with that. Yes, I'm with you on that.
And anyone who knows my work on diaspora knows that I don't like the term diaspora. So I totally agree with you that we're not vulnerable in the same place. And so that also makes this so much more resonant. What does it mean when God says, I'm not going to hold your hand anymore. I held your hand when I took you out of Egypt, but there will come a time. Maybe this is the time. Maybe it's right now.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say, Malka. Maybe it's now.
Maybe it's now, right? And so what can we do, right? Instead of saying, what did we do wrong? Where did we err? Who was the sub-denomination of Jews that brought us to this point of catastrophe? Maybe the question is, what do we do right now to rectify the brokenness, to fix ourselves? What can we do now that is not simply waiting around?
I'm curious also what you think is, or when is the time to reckon with those sins? Meaning to say that we don't need to look backwards and see what were the issues. I think that it will be hard to say that that's a biblically inspired sentence, right? Meaning there's so much biblical material that's going to be based on the idea of reckoning with our sins. So I'm curious what that looks like for you looking forward, and what place in the trajectory do you think, if you think at all, that there is a space to reckon with the pitfalls?
Well, I think we have to reckon with the sins, but then we also have to act on it, and we have to say, look, we're reading the Tanakh, we're reading the Torah regularly in our shuls, and we're constantly reminded of these metaphors, these analogies, and we're glossing over the very painful sides of these images. The suffering wife, the ravished woman. And the prophets were not sloppy. They were not stupid, and they were not abusive. They understood the pain and there was a reason why they imagined the polity of the Jewish people, the polity of Israel, as experiencing what a vulnerable wife or girl would experience. In other words, they understood. They were sympathetic. They were empathetic. The question is, did they imagine a time where these images would be replaced by other ones, or reconstructed in a way that bypass the pain? Look, it's a new breed. We have a new slate. We're in a new era. No one knows what's going to be in a month or a year, but I think that we're in an internal crisis right now, because we're, I don't want to say we're risking sectarianism, but I think that we are in danger of splintering in a way that will not allow us to build a new breed. You can't build a breed with God if you are not in
You know, what's interesting also is that, and I'm going to say like a really ridiculous, generalization, but in Israel, for a whole host of reasons, it's a melting of different cultures that came from different places around the world, right? If from a Jewish perspective, we don't have the same kind of sectarianism. There's traditionalism, and there's a whole very big spectrum of what it means to be religious, which I think actually resonates much more with the idea of an Am, whereas the sectarianism from a religious perspective is still very much alive in communities outside of Israel. What does divide tremendously in Israel is the political differences. And outside of Israel, you have both of those. I mean, you have both the political differences and the sectarianism, whereas in Israel, there's a lot less attention paid to the sectarianism, the advantage of which more people are in, and the disadvantage, if you're looking at it from a religious perspective, is that many people who are religious also are much more free with the religious practice because the lines are far more blurred. So just saying that I feel like I actually relate very much to the concept of sort of just like, what is this common denominator that brings us together? But I think in terms of this question, what does this mean for this relationship with God that doesn't require any metaphor, to me also speaks to a people who are on a pretty serious high connectivity level to what is divine in the world, that they just say, oh, that's what it is, right? Dat Hashem is that I recognize that. I know what that thing is. I don't have to keep making up more words to talk about it, but it's that thing. It's that divinity that lives among us. It doesn't have to be something highly, it's not necessarily something highly sophisticated. It's something that is intuitive. To me, it's like reaching a relationship with God as the people, that God is intuitive among us, that we don't need to exercise so many words to describe it. Does that make sense?
When you put that into conversation with the final verse that I read a few minutes ago, I think that there's a very important point there, which is, in this new model of a Brit Hadashah, no one gets to say who has access to the relationship. There's no gatekeeping. No one says, you should know Hashem, and I will tell you how to know Hashem based on my knowledge of Hashem. Anyone has access. It's totally democratized. So there's the gatekeeping model is out. Now, what does it mean to know?
Yeah, but you're reading that differently. I want everyone to pick that up. You're reading that differently. I think in the naive reading of this verse, it's saying it's going to be so obvious nobody will need anybody else. But you're saying it slightly more as a rebuke. All of you people who are trying to tell everybody what God is, we don't need you, right, Malka? I understand you.
Both of those things. I read
yes.
It and the second way. Absolutely, this description of someone kind of paternalistically saying,
"Yeah, stop policing what it is to know God." Right.
Everyone, and then these beautiful closing words that I think are so unnecessary. They're just some of they're unnecessary, but it's kind of like an extra act of love. I will forgive you. I will forget. For God to forget, that's the most unbiblical thing there is. Right? God is not going to remember. That is a Brit Hadashah. That is a new thing. You can try to tell me what it is, but you can't. We haven't built it yet. It doesn't look like anything that we've seen before. We've been struggling for millennia with these metaphors that are so hard, so challenging. And we're superimposing our reality onto the divine. We're taking our families and our relationships, and they're so complex and they're so flawed. We're putting them onto this essence that transcends God, that transcends time and space. And no, you won't have to do that in this new Greek.
Okay, but I have another question though. As someone who devotes her life to biblical interpretation, my question also becomes, Malka, there are those that will call taking biblical concepts and imposing them directly on reality, that will call that fundamentalism, right? So my question is, let's say someone has a plan of what this Brit Chadashah means, right? I mean, I think more likely it will reveal itself as a plan, but meaning, how do you see the relationship or the correlation between what's written in, a prophetic text from a few thousand years ago to how much we're supposed to create that reality on the ground, or we're supposed to, because again, I think there are elements of some of how you've been explaining this chapter that I do feel is actually developing around us, meaning there is even if you just follow some modern Israeli pop music, I mean, it's wild, the God consciousness going on in some of the most blatant pop music in this country. But meaning, I'm even thinking in the silliest level like that, meaning how the rappers of this country are rapping about God. Do you know what I'm saying? So, okay, there's one that's popular currently at the moment is talking about God as a father, but we'll forgive him for using a metaphor, okay? It's called tate tetahel, okay? Like, father, right? I don't know if everyone hasn't, if you haven't heard that one, please Google it. But that being, I'm asking a serious question, like a serious theological question, meaning, so you say, I see this passage. It's a passage I want to almost revive, but not the way the Christians have, right? That's why this is also such a scandalous, in air quotes, reading, right? We want to revive a passage that the Christians have been using for centuries to basically say that we're passé. And so the question becomes, how would you in your theoretical world, how would you like to see that happen?
How do you know when to apply a particular biblical text to a particular contemporary reality? Look, with constant sensitivity and never alone, never by oneself. That's my feeling is if one person individually says, I am Mashiach, then that's one person. To ensure collaboration and the building of healthy communities, we have to do it together. I hope that's not too vague.
No, it's not. But I think that what you're saying is that the work going forward, you're speaking about work within the Jewish world. Yeah. Work within the Jewish world that, hopefully will, emanate outward, but that we have to create something that's far more cohesive, that's far less reprimanding, that's far less, and as you're saying very clearly, that's also rooting out what many will view as some sort of fundamentalism or something that's dangerous, and that, there's all different kinds of things lurking around right now that different groups of Jews are finding dangerous, whether in the religious field or a political field, and we'll leave those as vague as they are. But you're talking about some sort of work within the Jewish world, but to sort of reclaim this idea of this Brit Chadashah for ourselves as a people.
I think if we are looking at this and thinking about our contemporary reality, I think we could agree that we're still living in a moment where the Brit Chadashah has not been established. And that fact, I think it's a fact, should invite us to say we can be the generation that builds it. That I'm comfortable with. That I think we can do. And I think that we can do it by reaching across these denominational lines and by becoming an Am. Then when we become an Am, we can get closer to this relationship that Yirmiyahu envisions, one without these metaphors, without these difficult images, one that is totally stripped of metaphor, and more intimate than we've ever seen before.
Dr. Malka Simkovich, thanks for being here. Thank you for genuinely rethinking a pretty iconic text of taking the image of Mama Rachel and thinking about the dark sides of that image as well, and of taking the image of this new covenant and thinking about how we can use language to create a reality, right? Very often we use language to define our realities and to give us clarity. But I think that what we're calling for is to take this passage and say, let's create a reality that doesn't exist and be inspired by this language. So I hope that inspires our listeners maybe to actually to move to some sort of action. And I thank you for your insights always.
Yourself, it's such a privilege to be with you. Thank you for having me.